Greetings and salutations, young true believers. So, today we're talking about this problem of universals, particularly the debate between metaphysical realists. Okay, what's metaphysical realism? Metaphysical realism is the view, at least in this, not, don't worry about the metaphysical realism we talked about in the last chapter, right? And in this particular debate, metaphysical realism pertains to the idea that universals exist. What do I mean? This pack of gum is colored red. This button is colored red. This book is colored red, right? So the question is, are they all partaking or participating in some universal, right? Some abstract entity, redness, right? So consider the example that Gould uses to start off this chapter. He asks you to consider his son's chicken, Rosie. Rosie is one thing, a particular object. She has many characteristics. She's red, weighs 5 pounds, has 2 wings, lays eggs, and likes to eat worms. When considering charactered objects such as Rosie, what he means by charactered objects is Rosie has characteristics that we are attributing to her, right? So when considering charactered objects such as Rosie, a key question for the ontologist, remember ontology being that branch of metaphysics that deals with what can be said to exist, right? So the key question for the ontologist is this: in addition to charactered objects, are there characteristics? That is, in addition to particulars, objects such as chickens, dogs, and humans, are there properties? In other words, is black a property of black dogs? Is red a property of red chickens? Is intelligent a property of intelligent humans, right? And moreover, are these properties, do they exist even without particular concrete examples of things to manifest them? In other words, even if there were no red books, no red pens, no red boxes, would there still be red? Would there be redness, right? Metaphysical realists would say yes, there will still be redness. The nominalist, by contrast, would say no. If there is no object to exemplify, right, to be charactered, as Gould puts it, then there can't be redness. There can only be red things. That's what the nominalist is going to argue, right? So, as Gould puts it, the question of explaining how different objects share similar characteristics is going to be called the problem of universals, right? And he quotes another philosopher, Keith Campbell, who he says nicely introduces the problem of universals, bottom of 248. Now, we can pose two very different questions about, say, red things. We could take one single red object, right, and ask of it, what is about this thing in virtue of which it is red? He says, call that the A question. What's the B question then, right? We're going to ask of any two red things. Any two red things, right? The button and the pack of gum. What is about these two things in virtue of which they are both red? That's the B question, right? So, following Keith Campbell, there are two facts in need of explanation: qualitative facts identified in the A question, and resemblance facts identified in the B question. These facts can be expressed by the following sentences, where the variables A and B represent the subject, and the variable F represents the predicate. So sentence 1 is A is F. So we can take A as F to be, this button is red. And we can take sentence 2, A and B are both F, the button and the pack of gum are both red, right? Now it's important to note that qualitative and resemblance facts are different in kind. Qualitative facts point to a particular distinctiveness. For example, the fact that Rosie's red, 5 pounds, has 2 wings, lays eggs, and she likes to eat worms. Each of these facts is a distinctive qualitative fact about one and the same object, namely Rosie the chicken, right? Resemblance facts, however, on the other hand, point to the unity of a class of objects, right? The chickenness of Rosie and all the other chickens, right? Or the redness of, say, cherries, right? This particular cherry and all cherries, right? All right. What constitutes an adequate solution to the problem of universals? And Gould tells us, an adequate solution would explain these real-world qualitative and resemblance facts. Moreover, right? Such a solution requires a theory of properties and not merely a postulation of properties per se. Properties per se don't explain anything. We need a theory of properties. Okay? Plato gave us a theory of properties when he posited 2,500 years ago that universals exist and they're real and they exist outside of space and time. He called them forms, right? What are properties? Well, what is needed is a theory of properties, Gould says, that provides at a sufficient level of detail an account of what properties are like and what roles they play, as well as the ontological commitments and grounding or explanatory relations among the entities postulated by the theory. I argue that a realist theory of properties provides the best explanation of the facts captured in sentences 1 and 2. Remember, sentence 1 is A is F, 2 is A and B are both F, right? All right. I consider what are, in my opinion, 3 of the most prominent and plausible versions of nominalism, arguing that none explain qualitative and resemblance facts as well as realism. If metaphysical realism is a better theory than the most plausible versions of nominalism, it is reasonable to think that realism is a better theory than any version of nominalism. Nominalism. That is the theory that classes of things, universals, don't exist. Only individuals exist. There is no such thing as a class of red things. There's only this red thing, this red thing, this red thing. But there are no classes of red things, right? There is no universal red. There's just red things, right? So he calls this, he being Gould, calls this Ostrich nominalism. And that's the view that there are charactered objects but not characteristics. There are ontological commitments to fundamental sorts of things and not just fundamental things simpliciter, right? In other words, there are red objects, but there's no such thing as redness, right? No individual thing in the universe is participating in the universal red. They're only red objects, right? Now, David Lewis is where Gould gets the term. David Lewis is a famous metaphysician, right? He calls this ostrich nominalism, right? Because he thinks it's like an ostrich, the nominalists is sticking their head in the sand, right? Why is that? Well, he quotes another famous philosopher here, W.V. Quine, arguably the most famous philosopher, American philosopher at any rate, of the second half of the 20th century. And Quine wrote that the house and roses and sunsets are all of them red may be taken as ultimate and irreducible. But the problem for Gould and Lewis and a lot of other metaphysical realists is this doesn't give us an explanation of the resemblance, right? They argue that the nominalists, and in particular, the kind of nominalists that Gould is calling the ostrich nominalists, they duck that problem. They just don't want to deal with it at all, right? Now, one last little bit of consideration about this. We've talked a little bit about the principle of parsimony, also known as Occam's razor, right? Which is the view that if for any given scientific theory or any mathematical theory or what have you, right, you're better off endorsing the theory that has fewer moving parts, that it posits less parts, fewer parts, right? All right. Well, what about this debate on metaphysical realism versus nominalism? Gould tells us, page 251, I now argue that ostrich nominalism is less ontologically economic than its realist competitor and therefore worse off with respect to ontological economy. In other words, principle parsimony, Occam's razor, right? In theory assessment, philosophers and scientists distinguish between qualitative and quantitative parsimony. Qualitative parsimony has to do with the measure of a theory's fundamental sorts of things, whereas quantitative parsimony has to do with the measure of a theory's fundamental things. Qualitative economy is typically regarded as more important than quantitative economy. If so, then since realism, that is to say metaphysical realism, is more qualitatively parsimonious than ostrich nominalism, it's the better theory overall, right? Recall, the ostrich is committed ontologically to fundamental sorts of things. The use of predicates carries ontological commitments for the ostrich to charactered objects, red things, sweet things, colored things, human things, and so on. While the metaphysical realist is committed to 3, right? According to one version of realism discussed later, fundamental sorts of things, the Ostrich nominalist is committed to far more. For the metaphysical realist, red things are not fundamental sorts of things. Rather, red things are further explained in terms of particular, exemplifying the universal redness. A particular exemplifying the universal redness, right? The fundamental sorts of things for the realist are the particular, the universal, and the exemplification relation. So just 3 things. Again, the particular, the universal, and the exemplification relation. The exemplification relation means here is this particular, right? The universal is red, and this object is exemplifying red, right? All right. For a nominalist, for the Ostrich nominalist, right? Red things are fundamental sorts of things, and so too for any charactered object that shares a similarity with other charactered objects along some dimension. But then it follows that realism and not Ostrich nominalism is qualitatively more parsimonious and a better overall theory.